The year 1934 marked a period of profound social and legal transition in the United Kingdom, following the turbulence of the Great Depression. In the seemingly quiet, rural agricultural county of Lincolnshire, far from the industrial centres and political turmoil of London, the rigid social norms governing marriage, morality and class still held significant sway. In this environment, Ethel Major, a middle-aged wife living in a council house in the secluded village of Kirkby-on-Bain, would quickly become the focus of a sensational poisoning case that drew the scrutiny of the nation's fledgling forensic establishment and the unforgiving gaze of the public. The legal and scientific landscape of the time played a critical role in the proceedings. While forensic science, particularly toxicology, was advancing, the public's understanding of poisons like strychnine, a substance often used then for pest control, remained sensationalized. The mere presence of such a toxic alkaloid could swiftly shift a death from natural causes to suspected foul play. Furthermore, the British legal system and public discourse in the 1930s often subjected women accused of violent or calculating crimes, especially against their husbands, to intense moral scrutiny. A woman's perceived deviation from expected wifely duties, coupled with rumors of infidelity or marital discord, could easily be weaponized by the prosecution to establish motive. The rural setting of Kirkby-on-Bain further isolated the family. For individuals of their social standing, living in council housing, financial stability was precarious, and marriage was often seen as an unbreakable economic necessity. The concept of divorce was inaccessible or socially ruinous for many working-class families. This social pressure meant that deep-seated marital problems, financial strife, and suspicions of infidelity were often left unresolved, festering behind closed doors until they reached a catastrophic breaking point. Behind the facade of the Major family's modest council house, these tensions had been building for years. Ethel Major and Arthur Major resided at two council houses in the village of Kirkby-on-Bain, Lincolnshire. Their lives were defined by the modest circumstances of the working class in 1930s rural England. Arthur Major, aged 44 at the time of his death, earned his living as a lorry driver, truck driver, a physically demanding occupation that provided the primary, though often tenuous, source of income for the family. Ethel, approximately 43 years old, was primarily a homemaker. The couple shared children, contributing to the familial obligations that bound their contentious marriage. The available documentation indicates that the domestic life of the Majors was fraught with perpetual conflict, suspicion, and deep resentment. The prosecution's subsequent case would characterize the marriage as profoundly broken, suggesting that Ethel harbored intense bitterness toward her husband. One significant source of marital strain was the revelation that Ethel had a child out of wedlock prior to her marriage to Arthur. This piece of personal history, viewed through the moralistic lens of the time, likely provided Arthur with ammunition for verbal abuse and disrespect, exacerbating the friction within the household. It was reported that Arthur's conduct towards his wife and children was often abusive and harsh, placing Ethel in a vulnerable and subordinate position within the home. The prosecution's narrative centered on jealousy and revenge as the core motivating factors. Arthur was suspected by Ethel of having an extramarital affair, fueling her sense of betrayal and igniting a desire to escape the restrictive and volatile marriage. In the social and economic setting of the 1930s, divorce was both financially punitive and socially stigmatizing for people in their position. For Ethel, separation or divorce was not a viable pathway to freedom. This perceived lack of alternatives, coupled with Arthur's alleged cruelty and infidelity, established a plausible framework for the prosecution's argument that she resorted to desperate measures. This domestic crisis was set against the backdrop of Ethel's limited resources. Financially reliant on Arthur and isolated in their rural council house, her options for resolving the conflict legally or socially were severely constrained. Her position, as a woman facing intense marital strife and potential exposure of her past, placed her firmly in the cohort of the socially vulnerable. This vulnerability, the prosecution would argue, drove her to seek a drastic and permanent solution to her suffering. The investigation would later hinge on one critical external factor related to Ethel's father, who was employed as a gamekeeper, a professional role involving the control of pests to protect game animals. This occupation provided access to substances not commonly found in a domestic setting, specifically strychnine, a potent poison used to eliminate vermin. This access, or alleged access, would form the eventual point of no return. A critical turn in the story, leading directly to the events of Part 3, involved this potential access to the deadly alkaloid. Though the precise details remain contested, the fact that Ethel had contact with her father, the gamekeeper, and the subsequent appearance of the poison would inextricably link her to the events that unfolded in the Major household. A few days later, those seemingly minor details will reappear, this time at the heart of a suspicious death. The sequence of events leading to Arthur Major's death commenced on the evening of May 22nd, 1934. According to the subsequent inquiry, Arthur first began to exhibit severe symptoms following a meal. Testimony suggested that the poisoned food may have been canned meat sandwiches, specifically corned beef or potted meat, prepared by Ethel. This was the mechanism the prosecution would later theorize Ethel used to administer the fatal dose of strychnine. The initial onset of Arthur's illness was rapid and agonizing. The powerful neurotoxin began affecting his nervous system, manifesting in the distinctive violent spasms characteristic of strychnine poisoning. These symptoms included severe muscle contractions, rigidity, and acute pain. During this period, the domestic atmosphere at the council house was one of intense distress and confusion. The family's immediate interpretation of the affliction was initially uncertain. While the symptoms were extreme, they were not immediately or universally recognized by those surrounding the victim as chemical poisoning. Accounts given by neighbors and family members suggested a rapid deterioration in Arthur's health, though the initial suspicion may have leaned towards a sudden, severe, and mysterious natural illness, or perhaps a sudden shock or seizure. The available records do not explicitly detail whether Ethel displayed distress or if her actions at the time of the onset of symptoms were considered suspicious by immediate bystanders. As Arthur's condition worsened, a physician was summoned. The doctor observed the severe intermittent convulsions and the profound suffering of the patient. However, based on the information available at the time, and perhaps due to a lack of immediate knowledge regarding the source of the illness, the initial medical assessment may not have definitively identified poisoning. Despite the medical intervention, Arthur Major's vital functions continued to fail due to the systemic effects of the poison. Arthur Major succumbed to his symptoms and passed away late on the night of May 24, 1934, just 2 days after falling gravely ill. The initial determination of the cause of death was recorded, though the unusual and violent nature of the final hours left sufficient ambiguity to warrant further investigation. The event that immediately triggered the official police inquiry was not the initial doctor's report, but rather an intervention from outside the Major household. Shortly after Arthur's death, an anonymous letter was dispatched to the police authorities. This letter explicitly raised suspicion that Arthur Major had been murdered by poison. The specific content of the letter suggested that the writer possessed knowledge of the domestic conflicts and potential means used in the crime. Reacting to this crucial yet untraceable piece of information, the authorities took the decisive action of ordering that Arthur Major's body be retained. The planned burial was halted, and the remains were prepared for an immediate post-mortem examination and detailed forensic toxicological analysis. This decision officially transitioned the event from a death by uncertain natural causes into a potential criminal investigation. The shift from a questionable death to a high-stakes murder investigation was initiated by the arrival of the anonymous letter sent to the police. The unknown writer's specific accusation of poisoning, possibly motivated by familiarity with the domestic turmoil of the Major household, provided the authorities with the necessary grounds to proceed with a full forensic inquiry. The inherent suspicious nature of the sudden, violent convulsions preceding Arthur Major's death already supported the notion that a virulent substance might have been involved. The crucial first step of the investigation was the post-mortem examination and the subsequent toxicological analysis of Arthur Major's preserved internal organs. The findings from the forensic scientists were definitive and damning. Significant quantities of strychnine were detected in Arthur's remains. Strychnine is a highly potent alkaloid, historically used as a pesticide, which acts as a neurotoxin, causing muscle convulsions and death by asphyxia or exhaustion. Its presence in the victim's system ruled out death by natural causes, confirming the anonymous accusation and focusing the investigation squarely on murder by poisoning. Authorities subsequently executed a thorough search of the Major residence at 2 council houses. While the exact moment the poison was administered was obscured, the investigation identified the likely delivery mechanism. Evidence suggested the strychnine had been mixed with food, most likely corned beef sandwiches or a type of potted meat. The ease with which the white bitter powder could be masked by highly spiced or pungent food made these items a favored vehicle for poisoners in historical cases. Crucially, the investigation uncovered a key piece of circumstantial evidence pertaining to the source of the poison. The police learned that Ethel Major's father was a professional gamekeeper. In this occupation, it was standard practice to keep supplies of strychnine for the control of vermin, such as moles and foxes. While the prosecution could not definitively prove that Ethel had possession of the specific container or bottle used, they strongly theorized that she had obtained the poison from her father's supply. This established a critical link: access to a controlled, lethal substance coupled with its confirmed presence in the victim. A second, highly persuasive piece of circumstantial evidence was introduced during the investigation. Following Arthur Major's death, the family dog belonging to a neighbor was reported to have died suddenly. The dog had allegedly consumed leftover or discarded food from the Major household shortly after Arthur's final illness. The authorities, recognizing the value of this supporting evidence, ordered the exhumation of the dog's remains. The subsequent forensic analysis of the dog's tissues revealed traces of strychnine. The death of the dog, exhibiting symptoms consistent with strychnine poisoning after consuming food traced back to the Major residence, powerfully reinforced the prosecution's narrative that food prepared by Ethel had been intentionally laced with the poison. During police interviews, Ethel Major maintained her innocence regarding the poisoning. She provided an account of the days leading up to Arthur's death, though subsequent legal analysis would highlight contradictions and inconsistencies within her testimony regarding the preparation of meals and her knowledge of the poison. She was forced to explain the source of the strychnine found in her husband and the neighbor's dog. The investigation synthesized the evidence: the confirmed toxicological presence of strychnine, the plausible source of the poison through her gamekeeper father, the supportive evidence of the dog's death, and the established motive of a highly acrimonious and abusive marriage fueled by jealousy and Arthur's alleged infidelity. This collective evidence, while lacking a direct eyewitness to the act of administering the poison, formed a strong circumstantial chain leading directly to Ethel Major. She was subsequently arrested and formally charged with the murder of her husband. The file was then prepared and transferred to the criminal sessions for trial. The next phase would see the gathered fragments of evidence, the scientific findings, the domestic history, and the circumstantial proofs presented for judgment before a jury. The trial of Ethel Major for the murder of her husband, Arthur Major, by poisoning, took place at the Lincoln Assizes in late 1934. The proceedings garnered significant public and media attention, reflecting the morbid fascination of the era, with cases involving calculated poisoning and domestic betrayal, particularly when the accused was a woman. The prosecution, led by skilled counsel, presented a compelling theory of the case that wove the circumstantial evidence into a narrative of premeditated murder. Their central argument was that Ethel, trapped in a miserable and abusive marriage exacerbated by Arthur's infidelity and cruelty, stemming partly from his discovery of her child born out of wedlock, sought permanent escape and revenge. The evidence presented was meticulous. Expert testimony confirming the presence of a lethal quantity of strychnine in Arthur Major's viscera, definitively ruling out natural death. The prosecution asserted that Ethel acquired the strychnine from her father's supply, capitalizing on his profession as a gamekeeper. Though the actual container was not traced directly to her possession, the opportunity to obtain the poison was established. The compelling evidence of the neighbor's dog dying with symptoms and findings consistent with strychnine poisoning after consuming waste food from the Major residence served as powerful corroboration that the poison had been deliberately placed into food prepared at the house. The prosecution thoroughly detailed the history of marital conflict, Ethel's reported bitterness, and the motive to escape the degrading marriage, arguing this desperation drove her actions. The defense faced the difficult task of countering definitive toxicological evidence with purely circumstantial counterarguments. Their strategy focused on creating reasonable doubt regarding the method and intent of the poisoning. The defense emphatically stressed that no direct eyewitness evidence existed showing Ethel Major administering the poison. The entire case rested on inference. They raised the possibility that Arthur, who may have been suffering from ill health or mental distress due to the marital conflict, could have accidentally ingested the poison or even attempted to take his own life. This was a difficult argument to sustain given the violent symptoms, but it aimed to negate the element of premeditation. The defense questioned the certainty of the poison's source and the police's inability to definitively prove that the container of strychnine had ever been in Ethel's physical possession. The defense highlighted Arthur's reportedly abusive conduct and infidelity, attempting to shift the jury's focus toward the victim's own negative role in the marriage, thereby mitigating Ethel's actions. Despite the defense's efforts to undermine the circumstantial chain, the cumulative weight of the toxicological report and the compelling corroborating evidence of the poisoned dog proved overwhelming. The presiding judge, in his summation, guided the jury to consider whether the prosecution had eliminated all reasonable possibilities other than intentional poisoning by the defendant. The jury retired to deliberate, returning after approximately 70 minutes with a verdict of guilty. Despite the conviction, the jury, perhaps moved by the tragic circumstances of the broken marriage and the evidence of Arthur's cruelty, included an accompanying recommendation for mercy. Ethel Major was formally sentenced to death. The moment of the verdict was necessarily dramatic, marking the end of the judicial process for Ethel, who had maintained her innocence throughout the trial. She was immediately remanded to custody to await the appeal process and the final decision on her fate. Following the guilty verdict and the imposition of the death sentence, a vigorous campaign began on behalf of Ethel Major, aiming to secure a reprieve. Her legal team promptly submitted an appeal against the conviction. Simultaneously, numerous petitions for clemency were organized and submitted, including appeals directed to the Home Office and ultimately to the King, urging the commutation of the death sentence. These efforts emphasize the jury's specific recommendation for mercy, the difficult circumstances of the abusive marriage, and the circumstantial nature of the evidence. However, the legal system and the political establishment ultimately upheld the verdict. The appeal was rejected, finding no procedural errors or sufficient doubt to overturn the jury's decision. The Home Secretary, after reviewing the case and the official recommendation, declined to grant a reprieve, adhering to the principle that a conviction for deliberate, premeditated poisoning, especially with a highly toxic substance like strychnine, must be met with the ultimate penalty as a powerful deterrent. The press coverage during this period reflected a sharp divide in public opinion. While some newspapers supported the finality of the sentence, arguing for strict justice in cases of calculated murder, others voiced considerable skepticism and controversy. Critics questioned the heavy reliance on purely circumstantial evidence and whether the focus on Ethel's morally compromising past, her child born out of wedlock, and the motive of jealousy, had unfairly influenced the jury, highlighting the underlying class and gender biases of the period. Despite the controversies and the petitions, the execution proceeded. Ethel Major was transferred to Hull Prison in Kingston upon Hull for the final stage of her sentence. She maintained her absolute innocence up until the end, consistently denying having administered the poison to her husband. On December 19, 1934, Ethel Major was executed by hanging. She holds the distinct, if grim, historical footnote of being the only woman ever to be executed at Hull Prison. The case of Ethel Major represents a stark intersection of personal tragedy, scientific evidence, and the rigid legal framework of 1930s Britain. The conviction, secured primarily by the unambiguous toxicological finding of strychnine and the powerful circumstantial corroboration provided by the death of the dog, underscores the critical role that early forensic science played in the justice system of that era. However, the subsequent plea for mercy and the lack of direct evidence continue to raise profound questions regarding the influence of public morality and the severity of the sentence. Ethel Major maintained her plea of innocence throughout the entire legal process. Before her execution, when pressed for any final declaration, she consistently denied involvement in her husband's death. Her final recorded statement was simply a repetition of her unwavering claim of innocence. With the distance of nearly a century, we are left to weigh the evidence presented against the context of her life. Was Ethel Major a deliberate poisoner who used the ultimate chemical weapon to escape an intolerable marriage? Or was she a victim of a system that readily condemned a working-class woman with a compromised past based on a compelling yet exclusively circumstantial collection of evidence? With the information we have today, do you believe the verdict delivered to Ethel Major was fundamentally fair? Was she truly the guilty party, or an ultimate victim of historical context and the prevailing prejudices of her time?